I'm not quite sure which part of the college football season, because it feels like some conferences are heading down the stretch and then another one just got started with the Pac-12. So if history has taught us anything, it's that you're making a mistake assuming you know the outcome of all of these college football games, because we have surprises every single year. The only problem is it might be time to maybe ignore that history because it feels very predictable right now. Now, when you say predictable, it can feel like a mistake, but let's run through it conference by conference. Let's start with the Big Ten. How many teams are still alive for a college football playoff berth? Well, it feels like Ohio State and how heavily favored they would be against the remaining teams. Michigan is not getting it done. Penn State's been a disaster. And yes, I am pro Indiana. This is not disrespectful to Indiana, but do you sit here right now thinking Indiana is going to beat Ohio State and then win the entire conference as an undefeated Big Ten team? I'm not sure that anybody's willing to make that bet right now. On the other side of things, yes, Northwestern's 3-0. The schedule, not great, but the defense, really good, especially closing games out. And then you have Wisconsin that was supposed to win that side of the Big Ten, who's played one game, and I think that started a year ago. Wisconsin's played one game, Clemson's played 8. So I don't even know what to do with the Badgers right now. It feels like Ohio State and no one else. That leads us to Clemson, as we mentioned, and the ACC. The ACC has two teams that are definitely alive, okay? It is Clemson, still alive, despite their loss to Notre Dame, and then obviously Notre Dame, if they were going to undefeated, they would get in. But let's look at Clemson here, because the ACC this season is taking the top two teams in winning percentage, and they're playing in a conference championship game. So if Clemson were to win the rematch and be ACC champs, they're in, and the people in the room would clearly look at Clemson and say, hey, their one loss was without Trevor Lawrence, although their backup was terrific, as we saw on that night against Notre Dame. But Notre Dame still has a very compelling case if they stay clean the rest of the way, and their only one loss would be, let's say, a close rematch with Clemson. Notre Dame getting in as the second ACC team, or at least at this point still being alive under that concept, is the scariest thing for the rest of the conferences that are worried if they're going to get anyone in. Let's look at the Pac-12 and let's be fair about it, because they have their own challenges with the late start specific to some of the states that make up this conference and some of the geographical challenges they had even getting people back onto campus. So Oregon is probably the favorite out of this. Very easy. You look at the polls, you look at where they're at. They're outside of the top 10. USC's at 20. Utah's been in and out of the polls, so you don't want to be unfair and rule anyone out. But the problem isn't just perception or the late start for the Pac-12. It's when will the Pac-12 have a chance to impress us, because they have less games, 6 regular season games, and then there's going to be a final weekend where you would hope, let's say for Oregon, if they're undefeated, if they're 6-0, and you're going to look at their body of work, and things could change, but I don't know that we look at it right now and say, hey, there's a ton of teams there that if they beat them, that's impressive. As it stands right now, none of the teams on their schedule are ranked. So their opponent in the Pac-12 championship game would have to be another ranked and undefeated team, which is asking for a lot in college football, and that's maybe their only chance. And unfortunately for the Pac-12, that still may not be good enough. The Big 12 is actually more complicated in the sense that if you're rooting just for the Big 12 to have a team in the playoff, you'd want Iowa State or Oklahoma State to run the table and be a one-loss Big 12 champ. There's a problem here, at least for Oklahoma State, and if you watch them against Kansas State, you probably didn't fall in love with the direction this team is going, but they're going to Norman to take on their rival against an Oklahoma team that looks like Oklahoma again. Oklahoma would finish up at West Virginia and Baylor, where they'd be favorites, depending on the outcome of the game this weekend. And Texas fans are saying, hey, we're also a 2-loss Big 12 team that beat Oklahoma. The problem is Texas has Kansas State and finishes with Iowa State, who's in first place right now. So Oklahoma has the easier path as the 2-loss team. But the problem is, if you're a 2-loss Big 12 champ, if it's not Iowa State, if Oklahoma wins Bedlam, then you're probably going to be a Big 12 champ at home watching the rest of the playoffs. Let's do the SEC right now, because this is the one that makes everybody the most mad, because there's still 3 teams that are alive: Alabama, Florida, and Texas A&M. Let's make it simple. Alabama, they get in undefeated SEC champs, no problem. If they beat Florida, and Florida has 2 losses, Florida would be out at that point. But what does that mean for A&M, who wouldn't have to play in the championship game, could say, hey, our only loss is to maybe the number 1 overall seed and the number 1 team in the country? Well, that would mean that Texas A&M would have to hope the Pac-12 champ is a 1-loss team and even maybe an undefeated team. A&M still may beat them out in the committee's eyes, which I know would drive everybody out west crazy. Maybe you have a second loss for either Notre Dame or Clemson. Notre Dame would have to lose 2. Maybe Clemson loses in a rematch against Notre Dame, so that eliminates the second team from the ACC. And then the Big 12 is a 2-loss champ. So that would mean no Pac-12, no Big 12, 1 ACC, Ohio State, let's use this for this example, out of the Big Ten, Alabama undefeated SEC champ, who would the fourth team be? You can't rule out Texas A&M. Are you mad yet? Okay, you ready to be even more upset? Because how about this scenario? Florida wins a close SEC championship game against previously undefeated Alabama, and the same scenarios around the country happen, and the committee decides, you know what, we think Alabama's one of the 4 best teams in the country, and we're putting them in the playoff. And I know how mad that makes everybody, but I ask you this. Did you ever think when Bama got back in as a 4th seed of the playoff prior to this year that it was the wrong thing to do, other than maybe being Ohio State was upset that they didn't get in somehow with 2 losses that year, where we debated that a bunch back when I was at ESPN. So A&M still alive. Bama, infuriating theory in general, but they could probably lose a close SEC title game if other things happen and still be alive for the playoff. Now, what about Cincinnati and what about BYU? I'm sorry, I just don't see it. As good as Cincinnati is, and I think they're very well-rounded, and BYU with their offensive attack, it's been really impressive. We don't have enough on their schedules, and I can't imagine the committee in a shortened season with all the extra challenges deciding at some point, you know what? I think I'm going to jump Cincinnati ahead of, what, the second ACC team, a second SEC team? I know that's what everybody seems to want, and is it that you're rooting for Cincinnati or you're rooting against another conference's dominance? And I think the same thing goes for BYU. I never like to think I can figure all this stuff out because we do have so many unpredictable things that happen in college sports, but this season, right now, is shaping up to be very predictable.